Greetings everyone, I'm Adam Haritan. Welcome to the woods of Pennsylvania. Right now I'm standing next to a tree whose existence is intimately entwined, not just with the birds, insects, mammals, fungi, and bacteria that live in this forest. This tree is intimately entwined with American culture. This is the iconic and appropriately titled American elm. Now the history of this tree goes back tens of millions of years when the elm genus first appeared on the North American continent. In more recent years, specifically in the past few centuries, American elm has experienced drastic changes that have altered the ways in which this tree looks and functions. Now obviously American elm is still here on the landscape, or else I wouldn't be standing next to one. But large, stately elms that are 100 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter aren't as common as they used to be, and many elms in this forest are dying or dead. Why is this the case? What happened to American elm in the past few centuries? Why don't we see many large, stately elms in the forest? And how likely is it that this species could disappear completely from the landscape? Well, to answer those questions, it's important to understand that people in America love their elms, and they've loved these trees for quite some time. It is well known that the famous tree under whose canopy patriots gathered to stage protests against British rule was an American elm named the Liberty Tree. Henry David Thoreau, the famous American naturalist and writer, frequently mentioned elms in his writings, as did Nathaniel Hawthorne, the novelist and short story writer from Salem, Massachusetts. Elm streets popped up in hundreds of towns throughout the eastern United States. Elms were praised for their graceful, shade-casting crowns that stretched across roads, creating interlacing, cathedral-like arches. Elms were also valued for their tolerance to stressors, including drought, compacted soil, and air pollution. Seemingly immune to most major threats, elms were among the most cherished and utilized trees. But the splendid scenes that were captured on countless postcards in the 18 and early 1900s turned out to be quite ephemeral, as American elm would eventually succumb to an incredibly pernicious threat that soon arrived on the North American continent. In the 1920s, Dutch elm disease was discovered in the United States. This fatal disease was first detected in the Netherlands in the early 1900s, and it quickly spread from mainland Europe to Great Britain, then to the United States and Canada, killing millions of trees. This is an American elm that's been killed by Dutch elm disease, and Dutch elm disease is a fungal disease transmitted by different species of beetles known as elm bark beetles. Spores from the fungus enter the bark of elms through wounds created by the beetles. Spores germinate into mycelium, the mycelium grows, and the tree's vascular system clogs up. The leaves wilt and turn yellow, branches die back, and infected trees die rapidly. Dutch elm disease devastated most of the large elms that lined streets all across eastern North America. It also caused much anguish among people who grew accustomed to the ambience these trees provided. But what people didn't anticipate is that the monocultured rows of elms that they planted along their streets likely exacerbated the spread of Dutch elm disease within their towns and to nearby towns. This is true because elm bark beetles have a steady supply of hosts when elms are planted in succession. It's also true because Dutch elm disease can spread from diseased to healthy trees through grafted roots. To combat the spread of Dutch elm disease, people initially cut down and burned infected trees. They also sprayed pesticides like DDT and lead arsenate, which caused a lot of collateral damage. For the most part, these measures failed to prevent the spread of Dutch elm disease, and most towns eventually accepted the reality that no intervention could save their elms. Now, some towns did get lucky, either because they were isolated from other towns or because their calculated efforts at controlling Dutch elm disease through repeated chemical treatments protected and continue to protect their elms from serious infection. So you can still visit some areas where decent-sized elms line streets. But most towns lost the fight decades ago, and finding large mature elms planted in rows along streets today is certainly not as common of an occurrence as it used to be, simply because Dutch elm disease is still present in North America. Here's a decent-sized American elm, and at this point in the video you might be wondering something. You know, we've been talking a lot about elms in civilization, but what about elms in the wild? Are wild elms seriously affected by Dutch elm disease? If they are, to what extent are they seriously affected? Well, what's really fascinating about the story of Dutch elm disease in North America is that most accounts of this tragedy highlight the loss of elms not from the wild, but from cities, towns, and parks. You get the impression after reading some of these accounts that people weren't really concerned about wild populations of American elm, but they cared deeply about elms in their neighborhoods. As it turns out, wild American elms were and still are affected by Dutch elm disease. And in fact, all native North American elms, including slippery elm, rock elm, and winged elm, succumb to this disease. This is true especially for the older, more mature elms. Younger trees can certainly still become infected, but are generally less susceptible and are usually able to reach an age where they can set seed and create offspring. Because of this, elms are still commonly found in the wild, sometimes in great numbers, but the average size of these trees is smaller than it was before Dutch elm disease appeared in North America. Now it's important to understand something else, something that sounds obvious but isn't given much recognition. Although Dutch elm disease killed and still kills elms, it's not the only reason large, mature, healthy elms are oftentimes absent from wild landscapes. To understand this point, it's important to know something about the ecology of American elm. American elm is a tree of rich, fertile soils that are somewhat higher in pH and full of nutrients. You typically find American elm in or near riparian habitats, in well-drained river floodplains, on the terraces above rivers, and on the slopes leading down into rivers and streams. As it turns out, these habitats have historically been among the most desired land for human development and agriculture. It has even been reported that to find land suitable for farming, early European American settlers in North America looked specifically for wild elms on the landscape. What all this means is that the preferred habitats of American elm have been targeted for development in the past few centuries, and in many cases, these habitats are gone. So yes, Dutch elm disease is responsible for removing many large elms from the wild, but development and habitat loss are likewise responsible, maybe even more so. And this kind of destruction certainly predates Dutch elm disease in North America by at least several decades. Now, what does this mean for wild landscapes? How important is American elm to the ecology of wild ecosystems? Well, American elm isn't just a minor component of bottomland forests. American elm, according to ecologists, is a foundation species whose presence essentially defines its ecosystem. The early season fruits of American elm mature late winter through early spring and provide a source of food for a variety of animals. Even before the fruits appear, the flowers, which are mostly wind-pollinated, attract insect visitors and provide an early source of nutrition. Many animals seek shelter or nest in elms or look for food in elms, and many fungi grow in association with elms. The complete loss of American elm from the landscape would have significant consequences that would ripple across many biological kingdoms for many generations to come. But is such a scenario likely? Is American elm fated to disappear from the North American landscape? Well, as I mentioned earlier, large, stately, healthy American elms aren't as common as they used to be in the wild, but they still exist, and it is common to find younger elms with healthy canopies and vascular systems. Because American elm is a relatively fast-growing tree, because it's relatively shade tolerant, because it can reach sexual maturity in as little as 15 years of age, American elm continues to be a common component of wild landscapes and will likely continue to do so for many years to come. It's been estimated that since Dutch elm disease was detected by researchers more than 100 years ago, nearly 400 million elms have died from the disease. Fortunately, some large mature elms have been spared, including this one. Look at the size of this American elm. It's huge. This is the largest American elm I've ever seen in the wild, and it's growing in a very typical setting. This is a stream valley with very fertile soil, evidenced by the presence of other woody plants, including black cherry, black walnut, nannyberry, and red maple. Now, I'm very fortunate because this tree is growing just a few miles from my home, so I visit this tree quite often. And I don't think too many people know about this tree. I don't see signs that humans are back in this area too often, so I don't think this tree is being treated with any chemicals. And this tree is proof that large, healthy, mature American elms still exist in the wild and can be immune to Dutch elm disease. I mentioned earlier that the history of the elm genus goes back tens of millions of years in North America. And it's mind-boggling to think about the kinds of changes elms have gone through in such a huge period of time. Perhaps the worst changes have occurred in the past 200 years with agricultural clearing, followed by Dutch elm disease, and even another disease known as elm yellows. Or perhaps the events of the past 200 years are nothing more than minor inconveniences in the grand scheme of things, and are rather inconsequential compared to what has happened in the distant past or what is yet to happen in the future. But who really knows? I certainly don't have any good answers, nor do I know anyone who does. I just know that I love finding large American elms. I'm super grateful that I occasionally run into them, and I'll probably continue to love finding these trees for years to come. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. I encourage you to subscribe to the Learn Your Land YouTube channel and head on over to learnyourland.com and sign up for the email newsletter so that we can stay in touch. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next video.